All right, this week, Israeli lawmakers in the Knesset approved the first bill of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial reform effort that aims to remove some authority from unelected judges. Now, the reform effort has led to protest on the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, concerns of a strike by military reservists, as well as criticism from President Biden and his administration. Joining me now, live from Jerusalem for an update, is CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell. Chris, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for working the night shift.
Great to be with you, Tony, and glad to be working the night shift with you.
All right, so describe what the Netanyahu coalition is attempting to do with their judicial reform efforts.
Well, the law that was passed the other day is removing from the Supreme Court the ability to strike down a law, a policy, a government action based on whether they see it as unreasonable. Now, this is probably the most politically active court in the world, according to some. And what they can do is, if the legislature passes a law, if there's a government policy, they can determine on their own opinion that it's unreasonable, and they can strike it down. And that's something that the Supreme Court here in Israel has usurped to itself, many decades ago, a couple of decades ago. And so that was what the law was designed to do, was to limit the ability of the Supreme Court based on their arbitrary opinion that whether or not any sort of action by the legislature would be reasonable and strike it down.
Now, Chris, not identical, but it sounds very familiar to what we've heard in this country over the last 50 years, where almost every election cycle, the activist court somehow factors in. And we want to elect leaders who will elect judges who abide by the rule of law, by the Constitution. So it doesn't sound like it's that far-fetched from what we've had to deal with here.
Yeah, there are some people, legal analysts like Robert Bork, the late Anthony Scalia, and actually Ruth Ginsburg had said that this, they said it was untenable what the Supreme Court can do over here. And Robert Bork, I believe, said it was the most powerful Supreme Court in the world. So that's some what's behind many of these reforms. And we had an interview the other day with Simcha Rothman. He's one of the architects of this judicial reform. He was telling us that many of the people right now on the political left that are saying, that are criticizing this legislation, actually were advocating the very same thing just a few years ago. His idea, and the idea of a number of people around here, is that the protests that are going on in the streets now and have been going on for the last 7 months are not just against judicial reform, but trying to undermine, demonize, delegitimize the Netanyahu government and bring it down.
So let's talk about that. We hear the reports of the protest from the U.S. media. Give us a better sense of what it's like there in Jerusalem and what's actually happening.
Well, the protests, as I said, have been going on for about 7 months, probably the most expensive protest funded in the last in Israel's history. This is a group that do come on the streets. A lot of Israelis are concerned. They do feel like maybe the legislation will go too far the other way. You mentioned earlier in the program that ABC interview with George Stephanopoulos and Prime Minister Netanyahu. He was saying they want to rebalance the branches of government here, and they don't want to go too far the other way. They don't want to give too much power to the legislature, but they really want to rein in some of this power that the Supreme Court has to give democracy, a better chance here. Now, the protesters are saying this is the end of democracy and the beginning of a dictatorship. I don't think that's true at all, but they are trying to rebalance the branches of government here. One mitigating factor, Tony, is the fact that Israel does not have a constitution, so they don't have a framework like the U.S. Supreme Court does. And so that's what they're trying to do in lieu of not having a constitution.
So what are the next steps? What will be the next piece of legislation and the next political move by the Prime Minister?
Well, the probably next step, Tony, is going to be a showdown, because already Yair Lapid here has taken this legislation to the Supreme Court, and also some non-governmental organizations have done the same. So they're going to hear those hearings in September. So that's really going to be a showdown. So you're going to have the Supreme Court ruling whether or not the legislature that has just passed a law limiting their powers is going to say, well, maybe that's unreasonable. So that's really going to be a showdown. In the meantime, there are other pieces of legislation that are down the line, and as Simcha Rothman was telling us, he wants to be able to negotiate with the opposition. He feels like they really haven't been doing that right now. But one other thing, Tony, and he was telling us there's one NGO over here that gets State Department funds, and they're helping fund the protest. It doesn't mean that the State Department is doing that, and he was very clear about that. But he did say that the State Department is funding an NGO here that is helping the protest. So it's not a direct, but it is an indirect help to these protests.
Yeah, that is not new. We're seeing that with this State Department on really three primary issues in countries across the world. That is the issue of abortion, the whole transgender LGBTQ issue, and climate. They fund these NGOs to try to shift policy in those countries. So Chris, as we're coming up here to the break, but how can folks here in the United States, how can believers be praying for Israel and for the Prime Minister and for the people in general?
Tony, very, very important time to be praying for Israel. There is really just a tearing at the threads of the Israeli society here. Pray for wisdom for the leaders. Pray that there would be some negotiations, and pray for reconciliation between Israelis. It's a very divisive time over here. I would think that's maybe number one. Pray for reconciliation between these Jewish brothers of ours.
All right. Chris Mitchell, always great to see you. And again, sincerely appreciate you staying up so late there in Israel to join us.
Sure. Great to be with you, Tony.